Good morning. I'm Caroline Troopgill. Welcome to this news briefing from the 252nd National Meeting and Exposition of the American Chemical Society in Philadelphia. We're joined today by Dr. Erin Lavik from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She will be talking to us about her work on potentially life-saving nanoparticles that speed blood clotting. Dr. Lavik?
All right, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. So we started developing this technology many years ago, and it really came out of our interest in looking at the impact of hemorrhaging on spinal cord injury and brain injury. After those injuries, you have a lot of internal hemorrhaging. And we wanted to be able to ask the question of what happens when you stop that hemorrhaging. And the simple thing is, of course, just to get a technology and stop the internal bleeding. And we were really shocked, actually, to find out that there really weren't good products to control internal bleeding, and that's what motivated this work. At the time, I thought it would be a 6-month project, and my student was going to make a new hemostatic nanoparticle, and we'd use it in all these different models, and it would be great. And 6 years later, I remember him turning to me and saying, "I can't believe you told me this was 6 months." What we've developed is an incredibly simple technology. And again, you would think a simple technology wouldn't be hard. And what we found is that really the subtleties of it are so critical in making this technology work. It's a nanoparticle. It's made out of the same material you see in degradable sutures. So this is polylactic coglycolic acid. We also make particles out of polylactic acid, and for anyone who has a passion for chemistry, by changing that out, we can control the temperature at which the particles start to melt. That becomes a huge issue when you're thinking about deploying a hemostatic nanoparticle. If this technology ends up being successful in humans, our hope would be it would be something you could deploy in the field. And you can imagine that if you're deploying it in, a medic's bag, those places can get extremely hot. And so we need to make something that's very thermally stable. So we've developed this material. It's functionalized with polyethylene glycol, which is one of the polymers you'll see a lot in the food industry and in other technologies. It's water soluble, and it creates sort of a water corona around these nanoparticles. And to that, we have very small peptides. So these are synthetic materials then that can interact with activated platelets. When you have an injury, you have platelets, and they get their name because they have a plate-like shape, and they become activated, and they expose receptors, and these particles are designed to form bridges. And if you want to play the video, it actually is a really simplistic version of what happens during an injury. So there you have your platelets, and you have a wound, and there we go. So you have your wound, and the platelets will become activated, and they take on what we call a stellate morphology. And then these particles are designed to really form bridges. Now, you have natural bridges in your body. You have something called fibrinogen. The idea with these particles is they augment the interaction and help to further make bridges and actually cause the clotting to happen faster. We're relying on the biology for specificity, so we're really relying on the platelets becoming activated at the injury site. And we've done a number of different studies and a number of different injury models now to really look at whether or not that's happening. And based on our data so far, that's what we're seeing, that we're getting faster clotting at the injury site. And one of the really critical important parts is whether or not those clots are mechanically robust. And based on our in vitro data to date, those clots really are mechanically robust. The kinds of injury models that we've looked at have included blast trauma models. Unfortunately, one of the biggest reasons that you get injured in combat now is from blast injuries. I think it's close to about 70% of the combat-related injuries are related to IEDs, and those lead to polytraumas typically, which is multiple kinds of internal bleeding in multiple organs. And we've actually tested these in those models, and what we see is we see less hemorrhaging in the lungs, and we see better outcomes and better survival. We've started now to finally get to look at the brain and spinal cord just a little bit to see whether or not these particles are even getting there to treat those kinds of injuries. And it looks like, based on very early evidence, that they are. And we think we're seeing less bleeding. So we're hoping that we can finally get back to that work we started so many years ago to see whether or not stopping hemorrhaging can improve outcomes, because I think that's one of the most critical things. The biggest reason a young person is going to die is they're going to bleed out before the trauma can be stopped. The biggest reason young people die is trauma until you're about 44, and then unfortunately other things start to get you. But beyond the trauma itself, there's the outcomes. And we're seeing, for instance, in the military that have been returning from our recent events, that many more of them are coming back with things like TBI. And so we'd really love to have something. We don't know if this is going to be that, but that's one of the things that we're really looking at now, is whether or not this can help ameliorate some of the impacts of that. We know that after blast trauma, you see things like hemorrhaging in the brain, and so we're trying to have something that can target that. And that's really the ongoing work.
Thank you. So before we get to questions, I'd ask that you please wait for the microphone and state your affiliation and name before asking your question.
Hi, so it's Kath O'Driscoll from Chemistry and Industry magazine. Could you say, I guess one of the big issues with something like this would be safety. And so I'm wondering how much control you have over the nanoparticles and how they exactly target the sites of injury, whether there's a danger of any non-specific types of clotting.
So that's a fantastic question. So one of the things about these particles is they are ridiculously simple. So in and of themselves, they really don't target anything. They're just flowing through the bloodstream. They get cleared very quickly. The half-life of these particles in the bloodstream is only a couple of minutes. They're designed to be something that you would administer after injury. What we're doing is we're leveraging the specificity of the biology. So we're really leveraging the activation of the platelets at the injury site. Now, I'd love to say biology is perfect. It is kind of remarkable. You do have activation of platelets at other places, and we've started to look at, in the different injury models, some of these injury models can lead to activation in nonspecific places, whether or not we're getting nonspecific clotting. One of your biggest concerns is always going to be clots in the lungs. The lungs have fine capillary beds, and those tend to be places where you see clots building up. We haven't seen that happening in these particles, but it is a huge concern and something we have to continue to look at. I think one of the reasons that the blast injury model became so important to us was to be able to address some of the safety concerns. And our thinking behind that was, you have so many different organs in that model that are hemorrhaging. If you're going to get nonspecific clotting that causes a problem, we thought there was a really good chance we'd see it in that model, and so far we haven't. We still always have to keep looking, but yes, it is a deep concern. You know, the ideal situation, if this worked out and it can be deployed in humans, would be to deploy it as early as possible. The earlier you can intervene, the better the outcomes are with hemorrhaging. It would be nice to have a pre-hospital treatment. The reality is that I think is a long ways off, simply because we need to know that it had exceptional safety to even be able to think about that.
Okay, thank you.
I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more.
Can you give us your name and
sorry,
affiliation?
Rebecca Traeger, Chemistry World. You talked about the very early data you have, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about sort of the animal models or what you've seen and how that might possibly translate.
Sure. So the very first model we did was a femoral artery injury model, and this was in rodents. And that one was done, honestly, because it's a simple model that my student had a great deal of expertise in, and it's a very high bleeding model. We saw that we halved bleeding time. The nice thing about that model is you can directly visualize bleeding, so we saw that we halved bleeding time in that model. The next model we did was a liver injury model, and that's a really good model for blunt trauma. A lot of blunt trauma injuries lead to liver lacerations, and the liver bleeds exceptionally. That one's actually a survival model, so we were actually able to see that we stopped the bleeding and improved survival. One of the things about hemorrhaging is you can bleed a lot and be fine, but then there's a tipping point where if you bleed past a certain point, you're suddenly lethal. And we certainly saw that in this model. And then we have the blast injury model, which is exposed to a primary blast wave, and that leads to hemorrhaging in the air-filled organs as well as the other organs. Air-filled organs always take the primary hit in a blast trauma. And now we're just starting to look at some of the models of brain injury and spinal cord injury, but that's extremely preliminary.
Ben Valsler, also from Chemistry World. How did you choose the peptides to actually activate the nanoparticle?
So we used the RGD peptide, which is one of the smallest, most ubiquitous peptides in the body, and it sort of makes sense that platelets have receptors for that peptide because you see it all over all of the ECM, extracellular matrix. So you can imagine if you're a platelet, you want to grab onto something ubiquitous. And we picked that honestly because it's simple and cheap, and we knew the peptide wasn't going to alter the chemistry of the particle. One of the challenges that we've run into in this with the first generation of these particles, they were looking great, we're feeling like superheroes. And what we found was that the particles can actually activate complement. And interestingly, you see this with a lot of nanoparticle technologies. If unfortunately you have to get chemotherapy and you get Doxil, it's administered very slowly. And one of the reasons for that is because of this complement activation effect, which can cause a series of complications. One of the things it can cause is vasodilation. And you can imagine it's really hard to stop bleeding if you trigger that. And it turned out the first generation of these particles did. So we think we've now optimized it to avoid that. But that's something that we're carefully looking into in all of these different models to make sure that we're not doing that. But that is an attraction, I think, of using. There are many amazing hemostatic technologies out there that my colleagues are developing, and they're really neat. But I do appreciate that a small thing like a slightly larger peptide can have a huge impact on the chemistry. So we've purposely tried to keep it as simple as humanly possible.
You said that the half-life in blood is only a couple of minutes. What does that mean for the stability of the clots that it forms? Do the clots get broken down very quickly because your nanoparticles are being cleared out, or are they as stable as a natural clot would be?
So from what we've seen so far, when these particles get bound into the clot, they stay there as long as the clot remains. As the clot breaks down, the particles are degradable, and they degrade and go away. They clear out of the bloodstream if they're in circulation, but it's a very different thing once they're actually bound into the injury site.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have an online question by somebody going by the name Marco Polo, and he comments, wow, and then says, how soon will this method be deployed into the world?
That's an excellent question. It is a challenging question to answer for a couple of reasons. One, there are challenges that come up. We never expected the complement issue when we first made these particles, so there's always the possibility of running into something we don't expect. If everything continues to go smoothly, there are lots of things we have to do before we can go to the FDA and start asking them whether or not this is something suitable for clinical trials. I can tell you, looking at the clinical trials for other hemostatic technologies, they're incredibly involved. Designing those trials takes incredible resources and a lot of commitment. So we're hoping to make sure that these are as safe and effective as possible. And then we have to think about things like scaling up. Right now we're making this at lab scale. So all of those things have to go into it. The thing you'll often hear from researchers is 5 to 10 years. And I think that's a reasonable estimate, but it's very much an estimate at this point.
Okay. And we have a question from Christine Suh, Office of Public Affairs. It's kind of similar to Ben's question, but it might be a little different. What happens to the clots promoted by the nanoparticles once the internal bleeding stops?
Well, so once the bleeding stops, you do have a lot of processes that involve wound healing, and clots break down as part of that. Based on what we've seen so far, we think these particles participate in that. The particles are degradable by acid hydrolysis, so the presence of water will ultimately break them down. To really look at it so far, we focused primarily on in vitro analysis. And in vitro, what we do is we look at the mechanics of the clot formation. There's thromboelastography, and we can look at how fast the clots form and how fast they break down, but it's very much on a short time scale. The particles don't seem to disrupt that timeline, and the mechanics of the clots they're forming are the same. But that's a really great question that we have to continue to look into.
Bela Buslik, Office of Public Affairs, ACS. What happens when somebody is on anticoagulant therapy? What brought this up was the reference to the rodents, and of course the way they will try to get rid of rodents is feed them warfarin, but so if you can revive the rat, will it do something for humans that are deliberately on anticoagulants?
That is an extremely good question. One of the things that my trauma surgeon colleagues hate the most are anticoagulants, because you can imagine it's one thing if you have elective surgery, but if you go in for trauma, it's a huge issue. And I am shocked by the numbers of how many people are on it. When I first started looking into that, it is a huge portion of our population. We haven't tested it directly with that. That's one of the things that we're doing now. But based on the mechanisms, it'll be really interesting to see. We think there's a decent chance that the particles can augment clotting even in the presence of many, although possibly not all of the anticoagulants. So anticoagulants have many different interactions. But we have to look at that. That is an excellent question and a huge issue in the field.
One other question. You mentioned that these clots are degradable by acid hydrolysis.
The particles, yes.
Well, the particles, okay. Okay. Well, in a human body, when you're stopping, so your concern is definitely not acid hydrolysis. Because like you're trying to get rid of something that can precipitate a secondary reaction, like a circulating clot stopping something and then causing further damage. Is there some concern in that area?
That the particles will break down too quickly? Is that
The particles will not break down in time to be able to eliminate them once they start circulating. But the body is going to try to move that particle because there's pressure in there.
Mm-hmm. Well, so a couple of different things I think are involved here. One is the clearance of the particles, and the body is incredibly good at clearing particles. It spends a lot of time trying to do that. And so we're leveraging some of that to get the unbound particles out. On the actual, once the particles are into the clot, the processes by which the clot breaks down will likely also lead to the breakdown and release of the particles. And again, one of the reasons that it's nice to have something that breaks down by hydrolysis is luckily, hopefully, we all have about the same amount of water, so that process should be relatively consistent patient to patient if we get to that point.
Thank you.
Further questions? Good. Well, thank you so much. The archived version of this session will soon be posted at bit.ly/ACS Live Philadelphia. Please join us for an ACS Science in the Congress briefing today at 11 a.m. on citizen science and chemistry. Thank you. And thank you.